All right, well, now we'll continue our discussion about African Americans in comic books. And we had established last time that, unfortunately, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, if there was a recurring black character in a comic book, odds are they would either be a sidekick and usually there for comic relief by participating in some sort of Jim Crow blackface minstrelsy, or they were African natives in a jungle comic. But now we're going to look at some exceptions to that in individual stories. Now, none of these that we're looking at initially are recurring characters, but there were some storylines that dealt with racial issues in mainstream comic companies, usually, well, in every case, just about by white writers and artists. So the first thing we're going to look at is a spring 1944 issue of World's Finest Comics. And that's the DC title that featured every month a story about Superman and then a story about Batman and Robin, and occasionally in the early days and then later always a team up between Batman and Superman. But that was the main feature. There were backup features as well. And one of the backup features in the 1940s was called Johnny Everyman. It was by Jack Schiff and John Daly. And Johnny Everyman wasn't a superhero character. He was just a guy that wandered around and talked to people. And each of these stories had a moral to it. Okay? So, in this particular issue, in this particular story, in issue 17, Johnny Everyman is in a story that focuses on, and this is the quote signed by Johnny Everyman himself, that it was dedicated to the millions of American Negroes who were doing their share in the armed forces and on the home front to win the war and usher in a new era of peace and understanding among men. And there you have men and women being portrayed in the various branches of the service as well as on the home front, and they are not portrayed, they're not drawn in a caricatured manner. All right, well, we're going to look at a few panels from the story, and I'm going to kind of break down the story for you. So it focuses on this guy named Ralph, who is a member of an all-black artillery unit in World War II, and the story opens up with them in battle, and Ralph, despite being wounded, makes his way to a machine gun and shoots down a German plane that is strafing his unit, thereby saving all their lives. Okay, so we got this act of heroism, and he gets injured. Then we pick up some months later, after he has healed up from his injuries, and he's home on leave, and he's meeting up with a friend of his named George. Okay, so George has a job at a defense plant, and Ralph wants to go to a restaurant to eat. And so they show up at the restaurant, but the guy there tells them that I'm sorry, these tables are all reserved. We don't have any empty spots for you. And the Ralph says, well, there's another place around the corner that's just as good. So they head out that way. And George is trying to tell him they're not going to let us eat there either. And Ralph says, nonsense. This isn't Hitler's Germany. But no Negroes allowed, he is told. And then he responds indignantly, what? Why, that's against the law of the state. I'm a soldier in the... and so, you see, this is not a southern state. This is not a place where segregation is the law. This is obviously in a northern state, but these individual restaurants still don't want to serve an African American. They choose not to, even one in uniform. And Ralph says, I've been away so long I'd forgotten some things. And then who should come along but Johnny Everyman, who turns out old friend of Ralph's. And so he says, "Come on over here. You can sit with me." And so the waiter can't really say too much about that. So they come in, and Ralph's feeling kind of ticked off. Sure, I'm a hero. Almost gave my life to help wipe out fascism, but so what? I come back here and I can't even eat a meal where I want to. What's the use? Well, that's pretty understandable, right? But Johnny Everyman, well, he understands, kind of. He says, "You're pretty bitter, Ralph, and I don't blame you. But don't go off the beam. It's not like you. You're forgetting a lot of things." And so then Johnny Everyman reminds Ralph of that time when they were in college. Not in the same college, obviously. And their two teams wanted to play each other, but it wasn't allowed because black teams couldn't play against white teams. So they went ahead and did it anyway, unofficially. And they had a game, and they became friends and all that stuff. And so then Johnny says, "You've forgotten those days, Ralph, forgotten that lots of people were free of prejudice then. And even more are today. You're forgetting the living examples of people like Joe Louis, Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, and the thousands of Negroes of every profession who've shown the world your race can do anything any other can." And then he brings out all the organizations of various types fighting against prejudice and the steps being taken by the government to eliminate discrimination, which we're going very, very slowly. But something's being done, he says, but we got to win this war first. And still think it's no use fighting for fascism. And then Johnny gets the point. Johnny understands, right? Johnny admits, okay, we got to win the war. Rome wasn't built in a day, but Ralph says, "But I wish there were more people like you." And Johnny Everyman says, "There are, Ralph, there are. All they have to do is learn the facts, get at the truth of things, and they will. I have faith in the people and our great heritage of democracy. They won't fail us." Well, it was a good long time before that stuff came to pass, and it failed people like Emmett Till and many others in the meantime. But essentially, this story, on the one hand, okay, it's presenting African American soldiers in a brave and heroic light, highlighting their patriotism and the sacrifices they're making for their country, and pointing out that it's in all branches of the service and on the home front. And they're acknowledging that there is some unfairness there to be off fighting fascism and yet to have segregation and prejudice at home, right? But Johnny Everyman says, calm yourself down. Be patient. Be patient. And gradually, everyone will come around. Why, they already are. Essentially saying that, there's lots and lots of people who aren't prejudiced, and the government is trying to do some things. So just hang in there. Well, this is not the U.S. history class. If it were, I would spend a long time talking about the long civil rights movement and the frustration that people like Martin Luther King Jr. and others felt by the 1960s with people telling them to be patient. All right, so this is, like I say, it's a much better representation of black characters, black individuals, but there's still this message, this kind of backhanded message that, yeah, we understand, but don't be bitter, don't be bitter, just be patient. All right. Well, in the early 50s, over at EC Comics, there were several stories that dealt with African American themes and themes of racism. And we've talked about some of those earlier, right? We've got actually 4 different stories here that I'm pointing out, all written by Al Feldstein. 3 of them appearing in shock suspense stories. So Guilty, we talked about that one. That's the one where the the sheriff is convinced the black guy is guilty because, after all, he's black, right? And so he murders him rather than take a risk of him getting off on the charges. And then they find out that the black guy was innocent. And, of course, Judgment Day, one of the greatest stories, comic book stories about racism, one of the most famous, justifiably, ever. And there's a couple of others that I'm just going to really quickly just tell you about. There was a story, the one in the upper right there, a story called Blood Brothers. And it's about this guy who finds out that his next door neighbor, who he's friends with, who's just an average Joe like him, has some African American ancestries, like his grandmother was black or something. And so now this guy is just all bent out of shape. The next thing you know, they're going to be wanting to go to school with our kids and play with them, and it's just terrible. And he was dishonest. He should have put up a sign, "I am black," I guess. And so naturally, he burns a cross in the guy's yard to try to scare him away. And then he, I think, sets fire to the guy's house, and the guy's wife dies. And then finally, the doctor, who is a more sympathetic character and is trying to talk some sense into him, informs him that, hey, remember that time when you were 12 years old and you had that horrible farm accident and you had to have a blood transfusion? You know where we got it? The black field hand. So you've got black blood too. Then there's a story called Ingratitude that is about this young white guy returning home from Korea, returning to his hometown and his parents, and he has been injured in the war. And over in Korea, he had a very close friend who had sacrificed his life to save him. Joey is the young guy here who's coming home. So this friend of his had jumped on a grenade, saved his life, and died in the process. And Joey had promised his friend, who was an orphan, didn't have any family. They had talked about what'll happen if I get killed. Joey promised him, you know what? There's a place for you in my family cemetery. And so he comes home to visit to his friend's grave, and his parents are kind of embarrassed. Well, you didn't tell us that he was black, so we couldn't put him in our family cemetery. People would talk. And so Joey tells his parents off. So stories there about racism, but like we discussed before when we were talking about EC Comics, other than Judgment Day, the black characters are just kind of over in the margins. The story doesn't focus on them. It focuses on the white people, either the bad white people who get their comeuppance and learn their lesson, or in Joey's case, the good white person who is trying to preserve the memory of his friend. But the black people are mostly voiceless. And again, Judgment Day was a big exception to this. Well, Harvey Kurtzman and Wally Wood and others over at EC were also telling stories in a similar vein, in a different setting, in the war comics. And this kind of brings it back to Johnny Everyman and Ralph the Artilleryman. So, a couple of stories in particular that I wanted to look at here that appeared in Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat that have a racial theme. One's called The Bunker, and it was written by Harvey Kurtzman, illustrated by Rick Estrada. And it's about this unit of black soldiers in Korea, which actually, there were no segregated units during the Korean War. That was ended. Segregation ended in the Army in 1948. But anyway, you got black soldiers, and then you got white soldiers approaching this hill from the opposite direction. They're both trying to take the hill and defeat the Germans. And they fight their way up to the top, and then they can't decide which unit should get the credit for taking the hill. And so they compromise and they put up a sign on the hill that says that this hill taken courtesy of the U.S. Army, right? Because they're all in this together. That was the message there. Um, the reason I bring this one up, what's significant about it, is that the black soldiers, again, they're shown in a heroic fashion, as heroically as the white soldiers. Then there was another story called Perimeter that was by Wally Wood. He wrote it and drew it. And it's about this squad that is, they're setting up a perimeter for watch over the night. And there's a black guy in the unit, Matthews, who's really religious. And then there's another guy named Tex, who's from Texas, I'm assuming, who's extremely, extremely prejudiced and hates serving with black people. And he tells his sergeant, you're a Southerner, you hate them too. And then at the end of the story, the sergeant fights all night long in the dark to try to, when they're ambushed, to try to save a wounded soldier. And the wounded soldier is the black guy. And then Tex comes up and says, well, you almost threw your life away for nothing. And the sergeant gets mad at him, and says, you need to, here, take his Bible, you need to read it. So much like, we'll talk later when we're talking about war comics and Asians in comics, Harvey Kurtzman and Wally Wood and these other guys at EC, they really looked at all different perspectives on these things in their war comics. Okay, now we're going to go forward in time just a little bit, a few years from that, late 50s and early 60s. Now we're going to look at the two biggest war comics of the 1960s. Our Army at War from DC, which had been out for many years and had been an anthology comic. Starting in June 1959, however, the character Sergeant Rock was introduced and became the star of the title from then on until I forget when it was finally canceled, in the 80s sometime, I think. So Sergeant Rock, who was the commander of Easy Company, which means Company E if you're not up on your terminology, Sergeant Rock at DC, and at Marvel, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos by Stanley and Jack Kirby, which debuted in May of 1963. So each of these military squads, led by a sergeant, had one black member, even though the units were segregated in World War II. In Sergeant Rock, the one black member was John Jackson, who was supposed to be a famous prize fighter, and he's not really even a regular. He's kind of a semi-regular. He shows up off and on here and there over the years. Although this particular issue is one that focuses on him. What's the color of your blood? In this one, he meets on the field of battle this German boxer that he had fought in the ring, and winds up the German soldier gets injured, and John Jackson gives him his own blood in a blood transfusion, therefore making him kind of like the guy in Blood Brothers in EC, face the fact that he's now got black blood in his veins. And over at Marvel, Sergeant Fury, and yes, that is Nick Fury, that's the good sergeant there chomping a cigar in the lower left-hand corner. Their one black member was named Gabriel Jones, usually referred to just as Gabe Jones. And Gabe Jones was supposed to be a famous jazz musician, a trumpeter, which, is is kind of interesting in itself. There's kind of a theme here that when African American characters do appear as sympathetic characters, if they're men, often they are either portrayed as an athlete or a musician, although not in every case. There's some significant exceptions that we'll talk about later. Well, we're going to go into some detail here about Gabe Jones. He was a more integral part of the Howling Commandos than John Jackson was of Easy Company, and he was a character that endured and showed up in a lot of different forms for a long time. Well, 1963, when the character was introduced in issue 1 along with the rest of the Howling Commandos, the Colorist, and the Colorist isn't credited in those issues, but it was such a weird idea to have a black guy as one of the soldiers in a war comic that even though he was written and drawn as African American, the colorist didn't get the memo and colored him Caucasian for the first several issues. Then I guess they got the memo, and so then they colored him this weird purplish gray color, and I'm not sure what was going on there. It's sort of like, well, clearly he's not supposed to be white, but surely they can't want him to actually be, like brown. And so they make him this purplish gray, and that lasted until issue 41. So for like 3-4 years, he was purple. Finally, issue 41, there on the far right, he is finally colored like an African American, his skin tone, like an African American normal human being would be. So took a while. All right, well, the issue that we just looked at the cover for, where it says Gabriel, blow your horn, that's issue 56. That one spotlighted Gabe Jones. He was the hero. It was kind of a solo story, although the rest of the guys came in at the end. And it's kind of significant in several different ways. So we're going to take a look at that one in a little more detail. So in issue 56, Gabe Jones is parachuted behind enemy lines in France to make his way to Paris because his mission is to rescue this famous African American jazz singer from the U.S. who happened to be in Paris when France fell to the Nazis in 1940 and has been stuck there. So he's there to rescue her, because to return her to the U.S. would be, well, among other things, it would be really good publicity. However, she doesn't want to go because of segregation. And so she's like saying essentially that it would be no better for her in the U.S. than it is there, and at least there she's like treated well because she's a celebrity. And Gabe is kind of shocked by this because Nazis, of course, believe that all non-Aryans are inferior and are trying to wipe them out. So he doesn't go along with that. But what eventually happens is that he sort of rescues her unwillingly. Not that he drags her along, but the situation changes and she really has no choice but to go with him. And then Sergeant Fury and the rest of the Commandos show up to extract them and to rescue them, but the Nazis get the drop on them. And Gabe and his new musician friend, they have the opportunity here to escape if they want to, and so she's trying to get him to escape because there's a bunch of white guys. They wouldn't help you. However, he knows different, right? Because they are a band of brothers. But he says, and this is where it really gets interesting, the conclusion of this story. He says, "You're all wet, lady, and what's more, your own prejudice is showing." And she says, "You speak to me of prejudice after the way I've been treated." And he says, "You better believe I do. As long as you feel the way you do, you're no better than the handful of white people who are giving the Negroes a hard time." And she says, "You can't speak to me that way. You're selling out your own people." And he says, "If my people are supposed to be a bunch of bigots like you," really bigots because they got 2 G's, You're blamed right I am. If you want to go back to the Nazis, go ahead. Me, I'm going to do what I can to help some real Americans. If you want to open your eyes, you can wait for me here. If not, so long, baby. And so they make their way in to rescue the other commandos, and the German commander takes the musician hostage, and she is rescued by the resident Southerner, white Southerner of the Commandos, Reb Ralston of Kentucky. And she is just shocked that a white Southerner would rescue her. And she says, she thanks him for saving her life and says, I never believed it possible I'd ever thank a man of your background. But, and Gabe cuts in, what the lady's trying to say is she's just made the switch from bigot to human being, Reb. And Reb says, shucks, ma'am, everybody's subjected to prejudice. So that's kind of interesting, right? So she's the prejudiced one. And the white Southerner is teaching her the error of her bigoted ways. And then she's so thankful that she tells Gabe as they go out with her head on his shoulder, Gabe, thanks to you, I'm no longer a Negro. Now I can go home and start being an American. You know it, honey, he says. I have a hunch the stories you're going to tell our people back home will make them feel the same way. So, stop being a Negro. Stop this hyphenation, this African Americanism, right? It's kind of the same message that Johnny Everyman was giving 20 years before this when he was saying, just be patient. Now, this story's set at the same time, but it's written 20 years later. 1968, I think it was. Pretty sure it was 68. So a little more than 20 years. And the same message is being put across by the white writer of the story. Now, Stanley and Jack Kirby were no longer doing Sergeant Fury at this time. They had moved on to other things. And the artwork here, if you don't recognize the style, is by John Severin, that we've talked about quite a bit. The writing is by a guy named Gary Friedrich. And he's doing something similar, although in a much more heavy-handed way than Johnny Everyman was doing back in 1944. He's acknowledging that there are some issues, but Gabe, the black man in the story, so his voice is supposedly authentic, is saying it's just a small handful of white people that are causing problems, and you need to be an American. You need to not see color because all lives matter. So that's not coming from a black writer. I don't think that would have come from Stan Lee either, because despite the fact that he was responsible in his youth for that whole Whitewash Jones thing, in the 1960s, he actually sort of followed the footsteps in a way of Harvey Kurtzman in his approaches to race. So, like I said, this story is extremely heavy-handed, and the first time I read it, I was like, what in the what the holy heck, Anyway, I guess that's enough said on that subject. By the way, those Sergeant Fury stories were set in World War II, like I mentioned, but they were coming out in the 1960s at the same time that the adventures of Colonel Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., were coming out. So it was not unreasonable at that time to think that some of the Howling Commandos from World War II, being in the late 60s, being probably in their mid-40s, would also have been longtime S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, since their former sergeant was now the colonel and director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And so Gabe Jones and Timothy Aloysius Dum Dum Dugan, who's the guy with the big mustache, were Nick Fury's two top lieutenants in S.H.I.E.L.D. in the 60s. Now, like I said, that made sense at the time, but as the years went by, they kind of had to age Gabe Jones more and more to kind of make him fit with that scenario, kind of similar to the conundrum that DC got into as years went by. Also, Gabe Jones has appeared on the big screen along with all the Howling Commandos except Sergeant Nick Fury in the movie Captain America First Avenger. All right, speaking of Captain America and the Avengers, there's one other story that I want to talk about while we're kind of talking about race and war comics. This is not necessarily a war comic, but then again, it is Captain America, right? So in this issue of Tales of Suspense, which half the issue was an Iron Man story and half would be a Captain America story. And that's because of that situation that developed when Martin Goodman kind of like backed himself into a corner and wound up having to have his comics distributed by DC, and they would only let him have 8 comics a month. So as they're getting more superheroes, they have to kind of like double up on them. Anyway, the Captain America story in this one has Captain America going behind enemy lines in Vietnam to rescue an American pilot, an African American pilot, whose older brother had rescued Captain America in World War II. So he has a debt to repay, a debt of honor, and the pilot, by the way, is named Baker. The story was by Stanley and Jack Kirby. They named him Baker in an homage to the artist Matt Baker, who had worked for Timely and Atlas in the 1940s and 50s, African-American artist, who had died tragically young of a heart attack at age 37 in 1959. Anyway, Captain America comes over here, rescues Baker, and during the rescue, here's another sports reference, right? Hey, remember when you were a big college football star? Let's just do it like that. And you know, he gives a speech about how important the war effort is, and so forth. Now, the reason that I included this was just because it kind of continues that theme of black soldiers being ex-athletes and or ex-musicians. But the real reason, the main reason that I wanted to finish off with this story is because it really it caps off more than caps off, no pun intended. It caps off more than 20 years of African American soldiers being presented in the comic books in a heroic light at a time when they were either invisible or were in an extremely submissive role, or were extremely racially stereotyped and caricatured, so that it seems like from, say, 1944 for the next 20 years forward, although things are about to start changing in a positive way post 1964-65, but for about the next 20 years after 1944, it seems like the portrayal of African Americans in war comics or war-related comics are really the best and most positive portrayals you can find during that time period of African American characters, other than in those few works that were created by African American writers and or artists. So that's interesting. And, well, a cynical person might believe that at least part of that may have had something to do with the fact that during that time period, especially, I mean, we go straight from World War II to Korea to involvement in Vietnam, and there's a lot of patriotism particularly even in comic books in the early part of the 1960s. And the message is being sent across to perhaps male African American readers of these comics. You are appreciated by the U.S. military, so be patriotic and do your part to, fight for your country. Now, I say a cynical person might think that. It would take a remarkably cynical person to think that was the only factor, right? Because I believe that Harvey Kurtzman and Wally Wood and Al Felstein in their stories, and then later Stanley in his stories, were really trying to address issues of prejudice and racism in the best way that they could at that time, and in ways that were more progressive and more enlightened than other white writers and editors were doing at that time. But at the same time, it can't be a total and complete coincidence that it's really only in the military-themed books that African Americans, especially African American men, are presented in a usually positive light. By the way, if it seems like I've put more than the usual amount of thought into this particular topic and have perhaps dug really deep to find examples to illustrate the things I'm talking about, it's because I did. I wrote a book about race and comic books that is currently undergoing revisions, hopefully for publication. So this is indeed something that I've given a lot of thought to, and there's much more to come.